the animal that figured out human language without being taught. In 1984, a harbor seal named Hoover died at the New England Aquarium in Boston. He had lived there for over 2 decades. His obituary ran in the Boston Globe. People who had never met him wrote letters. The aquarium received more correspondence about Hoover than almost any other animal in its history. Hoover could talk, not perform sounds, not respond to cues. Talk. He produced full English phrases in a thick Boston accent, unprompted, in context. Hey, come over here. How are ya? Get out of there. Visitors walking past his tank would hear a male voice and turn around looking for the person who had spoken. There was no person. The easy explanation is mimicry. Parrots mimic. Myna birds mimic. You expose an animal to a sound enough times, reward the reproduction of it, and you get a performance. That is not what happened with Hoover. Hoover was found as an orphaned pup by a fisherman named George Swallow, who raised him in his home in Cundy's Harbor, Maine. George talked to him the way you talk to something small and alive that you are responsible for. Constantly, casually, in a normal human voice. No training protocol, no reward system, no deliberate repetition of target phrases. Just a man talking to a seal in his kitchen for 2 years. When Hoover arrived at the aquarium, he already had the accent. This is where the science starts getting strange. Producing a human word requires a specific kind of vocal control that most mammals simply do not have. The larynx has to shift position. The lips, tongue, and soft palate have to coordinate in ways that serve no function in normal animal communication. Breath has to be actively shaped rather than just expelled. Most mammals, including our closest primate relatives, lack the neurological wiring to do any of this voluntarily. A chimpanzee cannot learn to say a word no matter how long you try. Equipment isn't connected the right way. Seals are different, not obviously, not in ways that would have predicted what Hoover did, but researchers studying pinniped anatomy found something unexpected. Harbor seals have a degree of voluntary control over their larynx that is unusual among non-human mammals. They also have a region in their motor cortex associated with fine breath and vocal control that doesn't map neatly onto anything else in the mammal family. Nobody had designed them that way. Evolution had no reason to. They live in the ocean. They don't need to produce consonants, but Hoover did produce them. Researchers who studied recordings of him identified not just vowel approximations, but hard consonants. The G in get, the H in hey, sounds that require precise coordination between multiple independent muscle systems. He wasn't approximating human speech. He was producing it. The accent wasn't incidental. It was specific to the region where he had been raised and matched the speech patterns of the man who had raised him. The question that troubled researchers wasn't how. The how had a partial answer. The question was why. Hoover had no survival reason to produce human language. No instinct pointed toward it. No evolutionary pressure had ever selected for it. He had not been trained to associate the sounds with rewards. He had simply been immersed in language during a critical developmental window, the same window that exists in human infants, and something in his brain had done what brains exposed to language during that window apparently do. It learned. Hoover was not alone. He was the most documented case, but not the only one. A white beluga whale at the National Marine Mammal Foundation in San Diego began producing sounds that handlers initially dismissed as equipment noise, clicks and tonal shifts that didn't match anything in the standard beluga communication catalog. A diver surfaced one afternoon and asked his colleagues who had told him to get out of the water. Nobody had. The instruction had come from below the surface. The whale, later named NOC, had been producing a sound pattern that approximated the rhythm and pitch contour of human speech closely enough that a trained diver heard it as a voice. Researchers recorded NOC over several years and published their findings in the journal Current Biology in 2012. What they found went beyond simple mimicry. NOC was not reproducing specific phrases he had heard. He was producing something more structural. The rhythm of his vocalizations matched the prosodic pattern of human speech, the rise and fall, the grouping of sounds into units that function like words, even when the individual sounds don't resolve into recognizable ones. He wasn't copying words. He was approximating the architecture of language. To do this, Knock had to drop his vocal frequency far below the normal range for his species. Belugas are called canaries of the sea because of their high complex vocalizations. Knock produced sounds an octave lower than any recorded beluga. He had voluntarily restructured his own vocal output to bring it into the range where human speech operates, not because he was taught to, not because he was rewarded for it. Researchers believe he was attempting communication. The word attempting is doing significant work in that sentence, and the researchers who used it knew it. What Hoover and NOC did sits at the edge of what scientists are willing to claim about animal cognition. The conservative interpretation is that both animals had unusual neurological characteristics, were exposed to human speech during sensitive developmental periods, and produced approximations through a process that resembles learning without necessarily involving anything like understanding. The sounds came out. We interpret them as language because we are built to find language in sounds. The animals were not using language. They were producing signals that landed in our language detection system. That interpretation has a problem. It explains the sounds. It doesn't explain the context. Hoover didn't produce his phrases randomly. Staff at the New England Aquarium documented that his vocalizations clustered around specific situations. When strangers approached his tank, he said, "Come over here." When handlers entered the water without his approval, he said, "Get out of there." When he wanted attention, he called out to people by name. He had mapped specific phrases onto specific social situations. That is not sound production. That is something that looks a great deal like use. The researchers who are most careful about this don't claim that Hoover understood English. They claim something narrower and in some ways stranger, that he had internalized a functional relationship between specific sound patterns and specific human responses, that he had built, without instruction, a working model of how these sounds operated in the social world he lived in. Whether that constitutes language depends entirely on how you define the word, and that is where the science quietly stalls. Every definition of language that excludes what Hoover did requires adding a new condition that wasn't in the original definition: intentionality, symbolic representation, recursive grammar. Each time the bar is raised, something gets preserved that feels distinctly human. Each time, the researchers studying animals like Hoover and NOC produce data that edges closer to the line. The line keeps moving. What we know is this: 2 marine mammals from entirely different species, with no evolutionary history that would have predicted it, developed the capacity to produce human speech after immersion in human environments. One of them mapped those sounds onto social contexts in ways that functioned like communication. The other restructured his own vocal anatomy to bring himself into range of a frequency he had no biological reason to access. Nobody taught them to do this. Nobody designed an experiment to produce it. It emerged from proximity and time and something in their neurology that we don't fully have a name for yet. Hoover died in 1985. His son Springer and his grandson Try also lived at the aquarium. Neither of them talked. The ability didn't pass down. It wasn't in the genes. It was in the 2 years George Swallow spent talking to a seal in his kitchen in Maine, not knowing what he was doing, not knowing what it would become. What Hoover learned, he learned the way children learn, by being inside language before he understood it, by hearing it as the texture of the world he lived in, by building something internally that had no name and no precedent, and then one day opening his mouth in a Boston accent and saying, "How are ya?" The science can tell us the mechanism had something to do with a developmental window and an unusual larynx and exposure at the right moment. What it cannot tell us is what it was like to be Hoover, to have absorbed a human language in a kitchen in Maine and then carried it with you into the water. Whether the words meant something to him, or whether they were simply the most powerful tools he had found for moving the large, slow creatures who controlled his world, we don't know. The words are there. The question of what was behind